This is the fourth part of the Crete Fashion Guide, and in it we will also continue to consider new mechanisms, talk about multi-block structures, how to extract energy with them and create farms. And I want to say thank you to those people who subscribe to me, write comments and generally tell me, advise me what to shoot and do next. Thank you. So, the Cray mod adds its own types of pistons. The usual one is called a mechanical piston and its sticky version is a mechanical sticky piston. Just like vanilla, but the difference between these pistons is that they can extend a huge distance. These special pistons have a point for entering the rotation, but even if you connect a creative motor, the piston will not move out, because you will need a piston extension. This block is installed only at the back of your piston and its number determines the length to which it will be extended. And now if we change the rotation to the opposite, then everything will work for us. But the sticky piston works on the same principle and you know what it does. And now the recipes. The piston extension is made of 2 boards and an andesite alloy, you will get 8 pieces. A mechanical piston is made from any plate, andesite casing and piston extension, and a sticky mechanical piston is made from a mechanical piston and any slime. And now let's talk about super glue, with which you can glue some blocks to others in order to move them, rotate or connect mechanisms to each other. There are 2 ways to use superglue. First, place it in your left hand, and now all the blocks that you install, they will stick to the place you clicked on. And yes, superglue consumes its strength for all operations and now I can move all these glued blocks together. And the second way. Imagine that we already have a building that needs to be glued together, but we don't want to disassemble it and build it again. For this method, you do not need to put super glue in your left hand, just take it in your right hand, click on one block and select the area you need and select the last block by right-clicking on it. And they are already glued together. But with this method, the blocks must be connected to each other, otherwise it will not work. Also, when you have super glue in your right hand, you can see all the blocks glued together. In addition, you can remove the glue from the blocks. To do this, click the left mouse button with super glue in your right hand on the glued blocks and the area that is highlighted will disappear. An interesting situation, we have 2 glued areas, but at the same time we are pushing only one. To avoid this, you can combine already glued areas by simply gluing one to the other. And you can move them together. And to create a super glue, you will need an iron sheet, a piece of iron and 2 clots of mucus. Now I will tell you about the mechanical rotator. With this mechanism, you can give rotation to any block glued together. This is how it looks and it has one input for feeding rotation from behind. And the front face is already gluing blocks to itself. We'll put some kind of block and connect the creative motor from behind and the rotation has started. At any time, you can right-click on the rotator, build up the structure, make the shape you need, connect it all together with glue and reactivate it. But that's not all. For example, using a wrench, you can change the modes of movement of the rotator. In the first mode, it takes the nearest extreme position when stopped, turning into blocks that can be mined. In the second mode, it can stop in intermediate positions, but it also has only one final position with material blocks. And in the third mode, wherever you stop, there will be no material blocks, they will become material only if the rotator itself is destroyed. And a mechanical rotator can be made using an andesite case, any plate and shaft. Now we will talk about the clockwork. It is needed in order to create a huge clock in Minecraft with reference to game time. At the back of this clock mechanism there is a stroke for feeding rotation. We will power up our mechanism and immediately take a wrench in our hands. You will find that the clockwork has the following settings. You can choose which hand will be the first, minute, hour and hour hand, but in the format of 24 hours. In our case, the clockwise arrow will be the first block that you put and it does not need to be glued, but the minute hand will be the second block after the hour. Right-click and our mechanism is already working. And to make a big watch like mine, just increase each arrow in some direction, then glue them to the hour hand and, accordingly, to the minute. And that's it. Click on the mechanism and it is activated. The gas mechanism can be made from a brass body of any plate and an electronic lamp. And now we will talk about windmills, which are a source of free energy as an alternative to a water wheel. And we will start with the bearing of the windmill. This is how it looks, and it will be possible to take the energy of rotation from behind. It's time to build a mill. But first we will need the windmill bearing itself, white sails, or sail frames. They have the same purpose. You will need a lot of them and some one block. We put a bearing in a block, absolutely any, it will automatically stick to it. Now we put the frames of the sails to any face of the block. They do not need to be glued, they connect themselves. You will need at least 8 pieces to make the mill work. Now right-click on the bearing and the mill will start to rotate. To see how efficient your mill is, put on engineering glasses. It's simple, the more sails you set, the faster your mill will spin. The rotation speed is also added to the frame of the sails, they just have a different texture. And if you use a wrench to point at the bearing, then you can change which way your mill will rotate. At the moment we have a clock. And now the rotation is the opposite. And recipes. To create a windmill bearing, you will need any plate, any stone and shaft. And for white sails, you will need 2 sticks of some kind, any wool and an andesite alloy. You can also make frames of sails out of white sails. This is an interchangeable craft. Accordingly, you can make ordinary sails from the frames. And now we'll talk to you about the chassis blocks. They will allow you to move a large number of blocks at a time and save glue. And we'll start with the usual linear chassis. The first thing they can do is to join groups of groups if they are directed in the same direction. In this case, not all linear chassis are moving, because some are directed upwards and others to the side. Also, with the help of a mechanical piston and chassis groups, you can move a large number of blocks at a time. And yet, you can apply slime or glue to the front face of the axis, which will allow you to glue the blocks that stand in front of it. And with the help of a wrench, pointing at the linear chassis, you can choose how many blocks will be captured. The maximum is 16. And to configure several chassis at once, and not one at a time, pinch the contour and do the same. And the settings apply to everyone. The next block is a secondary linear chassis. It has exactly the same functions as a conventional linear chassis. It is used very rarely, mainly to separate the structure so that they do not overlap. Next comes the radial chassis. It can also be connected in groups vertically. But the most interesting thing is that if you cover one of its faces with slime or glue, then it will be able to glue blocks along the radius around itself. In this case, the blocks must be connected to each other and touch the glued face, otherwise there will be such a situation, which is bad. To avoid this, you can double-click on any face with slime and automatically all sides will be covered with it. Also, with a wrench in your hands, you can configure in detail in which radius the blocks will be glued. The maximum radius is 16 blocks. And recipes. For a linear chassis, you will need 2 andesite alloys and 3 pieces of any wood. Also you can make a secondary linear chassis usually. And vice versa. Radially, the chassis is also made of 2 andesite alloys and 3 units of wood. Next we will talk about the Velcro block. When a groan signal is given, he glues the block to himself. A repeated restun signal releases the block. You can also stick to blocks that have already been glued to other blocks, or for example to a linear chassis, moving a huge number of blocks at once at a time. And to create a Velcro block, you will need 2 andesite alloys, any slime, 2 cobblestones and resin dust. Next, we will talk about the shaft of the gantry crane and the chassis of the gantry crane, which is needed to move blocks and in rare cases to transfer rotation. And we will start with the shaft of the portal crane. It is needed in order to install the chassis on it and move along it. Ah yes, the chassis can be installed from any of the 4 sides. Using the arrows, the shaft of the gantry crane can be increased very quickly. The mechanics are the same as that of a conventional shaft. And the direction of the strips on the shaft allows you to determine which way the gantry crane chassis will move. You can also change the direction not only by using the shaft, but also by simply changing the direction of rotation on the source. And the actual chassis of the gantry crane, which is installed by right-clicking on the corresponding shaft. In addition to the fact that the chassis can move along this shaft, it can glue one block to itself with a sticky side. Or as an option, a chassis on which slime has been applied and several blocks have already been glued. You can also stick to other faces of this block, but you will already need glue. Also, if you install the shaft not through an arrow, but through a clamped shift, then you can divide the shaft into several parts, thereby the chassis will move only within one part. And by giving a restun signal to the shaft of the gantry crane, you will stop the chassis and it will begin to transmit rotation from the shaft to this exit point, which can be used for its own purposes. And now the recipes. For the gantry crane chassis, you will need any plate, an andesite housing and a gear. And for the shafts of the gantry crane, you will need 2 andesite alloys and resin dust. Next, I'll tell you about the winch. The winch is capable of lifting or lowering the blocks glued to it with the help of a special cable. It has 2 points for feeding rotation. I'll connect 2 handles to it. Lower the rope down so that this part of the rope with the plate falls on the block and you can safely lift it. The block will already be glued, glue is not needed. Glue the blocks together to lift more at a time, but don't get too carried away, because you're not creative. Or use a chassis with slime applied. If you move the winch, on which the blocks are already glued, they will move with it. Also, the wrench will allow you to choose the operating mode of the winch, with which you can configure whether the block will be material during lifting under certain conditions. To create a winch, you will need an andesite body, any wool and an iron sheet. Next, I'll tell you about a mechanical drill. It is needed in order to destroy the blocks that are installed right in front of it. At the back it has an entry point for feeding rotation. Also, if you glue a drill to some movable structure, then it will not need energy in order for it to destroy blocks. And for a mechanical drill, you will need 3 andesite alloys, 1 iron ingot and an andesite body. And now I'll tell you about the mechanical saw. It is needed to cut blocks and to cut down trees. This block has 2 states. The first is when the blade is directed parallel to the floor, here it has 1 entry point. And the second state is when the blade is directed perpendicular to the floor. Here he has 2 entry points of rotation. In the first case, the saw is used when you need to cut down a tree. Also, the saw can be easily glued to some movable structures by organizing a farm, and at the same time it does not need rotation to work. If you want to cut down a completely large tree, then make sure that the saw cuts down the last block that comes into contact with the ground. In the second mode, the saw is able to cut blocks, but here you need to pay attention to which side you have rotation applied to it. Otherwise, it will be inconvenient for him to work with her. Therefore, pay attention to which way the blade rotates. It is difficult to understand by pixels, but it is possible. If you look at the crafts, you will notice that different options can be made from one block, and the saw accordingly chooses a random one from them. And to clarify exactly what you want her to do, just click this item on the filter slot on the saw and only this recipe she will do. And a mechanical saw can be made using 3 iron sheets, an iron ingot and an andesite case. Next, we will talk with you about a mechanical harvester. It is needed mainly to make harvesting farms. Immediately glue the harvester to some movable structure or mechanism. It is attached to the chassis without glue. And to create a mechanical combine, you will need 4 andesite alloys, 2 iron sheets and 1 andesite body. Next we will talk to you about the mechanical plow. He can make arable land, collect snow, other resources, and also push. It is installed in the same way as the combine harvester and works only when the block moves with it. And to make a mechanical plow, you will need 3 iron sheets, 3 andesite alloys and an andesite body. We have enough knowledge, and now let's talk about working with inventory for movable structures, which will allow you to store items directly in them and use them from inventory when necessary. The essence is very simple. When you have already glued the mechanisms, then you can also glue a chest to this structure, and it will become part of it. But while the structure is moving, you can't just get items out of the chest. You need to wait until it stops, or use a new block, a portable storage interface. To transfer resources, you will need 2 interfaces. The first one, which will be glued to a movable structure, on which inventory items, such as chests, are also already glued, and the second interface is somewhere else. But there is one rule: there should be a distance of one block between them. In this case, we will take resources from the movable structure, so we need to put something on the second interface that will take out the resources that it will receive from it. At the moment when the interfaces intersect, there is a transfer of objects. In this case, we will supply resources to the movable structure, so I connect the funnel to the second interface and load the diamonds. After the transfer, we stop and find the diamonds in which chest. And yes, every time the interfaces pass side by side, they will connect. But sometimes they just don't have the resources and it doesn't make sense. Then you can send a redstone signal to one of the interfaces and disconnect them, and they will not connect. And yes, the same can be done with liquids using a portable liquid interface. You will also need two of them. Also, a liquid tank must be installed in the movable structure. Well, accordingly, you must provide a distance of one block between the two interfaces. If you pour liquid into the structure, then you must supply liquid to the interface. In my case it is lava from an infinite source, and if vice versa, then you must pump liquid from the interface to another container. And the restun signal will allow the interface to ignore the connection. And crafting for a portable storage interface, you will need a gutter and an andesite case. And for a portable liquid interface, you'll need a gutter and a copper housing. Next we will talk about the arrestin contact. You should have two of them, and when they come into contact with each other, there is a signal with which you can control your mechanisms. For example, in my case, I stop everything by giving a red signal to the Rostovan on the clutch. These two blocks should touch only these faces, otherwise there will be no signal. And for the arrestin contact, you will need one iron sheet, restin dust and 5 cobblestones. Next, we'll talk to you about a new type of storage. It is called the storage of objects. In fact, this is a chest, but it will not work just like that to open it or pick up items from it. This can only be done with the help of mechanisms. At the same time, it holds even less than an ordinary chest, but it can be combined in multi-constructions 2x2, 3x3, which will increase the capacity. You can also increase its length. The maximum possible size is the width multiplied by 3. That is, if you have 2x2, then multiply 2 by 3, that's 6. If you have 3 by 3, then multiply 3 by 3, 9. If you overdo it, then its texture will simply split into two parts and you will understand it. And to create a storage of items, you will need 2 iron sheets and a barrel. Next, I'll tell you about a sequential gearbox, which will allow you to create sequences of actions for different mechanisms. That's what she looks like. It is installed in front of the entry point of the rotational energy of the mechanism that you will control. When you open it for the first time, you will find the following interface. This is where you will be able to add new actions. Hover over one of these actions and just spin the wheel and you can choose turn, piston, delay, restun signal or end action. To start work, you must send a restun signal to the sequential gearbox, and it will execute the sequence. In addition to the actions themselves, you can choose their parameters. I want, for example, to make sure that we have a rotation of 180 degrees, changing the degrees also with a wheel, and here you can choose the speed and direction of rotation. Well, then I set the same action with the same degree, only in the opposite direction, changing the direction of this arrow here. In the second half of the screen you can see what it looks like. And 2 ticks means that there will be a rotation with double the speed. With the action of the piston, you can set the distance to which it will move out and the direction. But don't go in the wrong direction, otherwise nothing will work for you. As it is now, I have completed only one action, and if I change it, then everything will work. The delay, accordingly, adds a delay before performing any action. Only I want to warn you, T is tiki. If you want to set a second, then just scroll a little further, and the action of the signal will require you to have another restun signal to continue the sequence of actions. And you can make a sequential gearbox using a gear, a brass case, an electronic lamp. That's it for me. Thanks for watching friends. There was a hole with you and I think we are still waiting for a series on this amazing fashion.